Hello and welcome back to AP World History Modern. Today we are going to begin Unit 7.1. Going to be our first of 2 days on this unit. Looking at shifting power after the 1900s. Right? And our learning objective is going to be to explain how internal and external factors contributed to change in various states after 1900. And there's a look at our curriculum. All right. Specifically today, we're going to be kind of focusing in on the Ottomans. I'm going to do kind of spend some time on the Ottomans. All right, but first thing I want to just mention real quick is welcome to time period 4. It doesn't really mean anything. What you need to know, though, is that this is 1900 to present. So this is the last of our time periods. And you'll notice the time grid here created by Mr. Freeman. It's a little denser than a normal time grid is, but it makes sense because this last time period, 1900 to present, is a much denser time period. It's also given more weight by the College Board on the AP exam, and that's why we see it broken up into 3 separate units. Instead of the normal 2, like we saw with the previous 3 time periods. So we're going to be spending the rest of our year by looking at this time period, 1900 to present. And of course, Unit 7, our first unit for this time period is going to be on global conflicts. So largely focusing in on, what's leading up to World War I, what happens after World War I, and then into World War II. All right, so and the kind of immediate aftermath of that. So that's what we're going to be dealing with for this unit. All right, and then and then kind of transitioning to decolonization in the next unit, and then things like Green Revolution and globalization, more economic stuff in the last unit. All right, so yes, welcome to the contemporary period of AP World History, 1900 to present. All right, so today we're going to talk about Turkey, or the transition from the Ottoman Empire to Turkey. And of course, to understand that transition, it's always a good idea to be aware of Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, right? Ataturk, a huge force in this transition. In the 20th century is full of nationalist leaders that we're going to be looking at this year. So if you want to kind of create little categories of analysis around these nationalist leaders, we could easily do this, right? So some nationalist leaders are like Kemal Ataturk, in that they advocate westernization, modernization, and secularization, right? So just kind of make sure, I'm assuming you know what modernization means. We've used that word before in talking about the Meiji period of Japan. I'm assuming you know what westernization means, emulating the cultural practices and economic techniques of the West, right? So Europeans, the United States, right, etc. And but secularization might be a word that you're not familiar with. Secularization or secular refers to non-religious or separating government and politics from religion. So secular, non-religious, profane means religious, right? So the secular versus the profane. So we see Ataturk as an example of a secular, right, modernizer, right, of the former Ottoman Empire, modern day Turkey, right, westernization. All right, so, and you can kind of contrast him to the person that you probably are more familiar with, which is Gandhi. And it's not that Gandhi did not own a suit, right? Gandhi certainly owned a suit when he went to England and went to law school. He certainly owned a suit when he was working as a lawyer in South Africa, representing South Asians. But during the First World War, when he goes from South Africa back to South Asia, to join the nationalist movement, this is when he abandons the suit, right, and adorns kind of that traditional temple garb, celebrates, and really kind of practices, right, a lot of kind of key aspects of Hinduism. Right, so when we'll talk about that at a later time. But yeah, there's different forms of nationalism. Those that reject westernization, right? Those that reject, their former colonial authorities, and and trying to celebrate, their culture that existed before that time period. And then there's those who embrace westernization and secularization. So that's kind of ways that you could possibly categorize different nationalist movements. All right, but we're talking about Ataturk, right? And looking at this photograph from a wedding, this is indistinguishable from a wedding you might see anywhere in Europe or the United States from this time period. All right, but let's talk real quick about what happens in the Ottoman Empire and this change from the Ottomans to what eventually becomes Turkey. And first thing I just want to start here with, if you look at this date here, 1913. What was the Ottoman Empire? And you can see it running through the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, so controlling Mecca, right into the Tigris-Euphrates river valleys. But you notice that it doesn't really control much else, island of Crete, but not much to the west of what is Istanbul, right? So historically, we think of the Ottoman Empire. North Africa would be there, and of course, much of Southeast Europe would be there. But notice, by the time we get to World War I, there's already a kind of a tremendous amount of what used to be the Ottoman Empire gone, right? And then, of course, we can see what happens in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. All right, so, when looking at this, let's just kind of break this down a little bit and kind of make sure we are, right, we're kind of breaking this down. So, all right, where are we here? Right there. So, Ottoman Empire, and we are transitioning here to what we would call today Turkey. Right. And of course, we're going to be focusing in on specifically Kemal Ataturk. Right. So let's just kind of go back one right here, just to kind of make sure you can see that. Okay. So. Now, Ataturk. All right, let me pop that back up. All right, so this is our kind of nationalist leader that we're going to be focusing in on as we kind of make that transition from the Ottoman to Turkey. All right. So a couple things, because our learning objective today is asking us to break down some of the external factors, right, and some of our internal factors. Right, some of our internal factors. So as far as our external factors are concerned, some of the things that we just saw on that map is, right, a very real loss, right, loss of land, right, a very real loss of land. And some of the kind of examples that we've already talked about in this class is, in the 1820s, we see Greek independence. Right? Greek independence will take place, will occur. We also see, I'm just going to put here, by the 1840s. And I'm going to put by the 1840s because I am not an expert on Egyptian history, but based on what I know from Egypt, I know that by the 1840s, Egypt is acting as an independent sovereign state. Before that, the 1890s, we see the Mamluks, right, asserting control. The French will come in the very last year or two of the 1890s and take over, and they'll be there for about 3 or 4 years, and then they will leave, and then the Ottomans will send in Muhammad Ali. And we know that Muhammad Ali does still do a lot of operations for the Ottomans. I mean, we know they will retake, the city of Mecca, right, in the late 18 teens, from the Sauds. And, so where that actual line is broken, I'm not 100% positive myself. I know Muhammad Ali sends troops to help the Ottomans, during the Greek Independence War, and that's in the mid 1820s that takes place. But by the time we get to the late 1830s, early 1840s, we see Egypt making moves on Istanbul, and the British being forced to intervene, on behalf of the Ottomans to protect it. So, really by 1839 to 41, we see Egypt kind of acting independent. So anyway, kind of on a tangent there, so I apologize. But right, so we see that taking place. There's also a bunch of other things happening and let's just kind of put our date there. 1878, because there's a lot of things going on in 1878. Let me just kind of go to a slide here and talk about some of this. All right, so in 1878, right, we're seeing kind of a Slavic movement that goes back to a couple years before in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they're getting support from Montenegro and Serbia. So by 1878. We're seeing Austria-Hungary, right, taking over or at least occupying it. Right, so Bosnia, Herzegovina. Right, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Austria-Hungary. And I have a tendency to write AH. So I better write that in there. Austria-Hungary, right? Austria-Hungary will take it over, and then by 1908, they will officially Austria-Hungary will annex it. Right? They will officially annex it, and make it part of their state. All right. Now the obvious question is, and obviously most students know this, why does it matter that in 1908 the Bosnia is annexed? Bosnia is annexed by the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, by the Habsburgs. Most students are pretty quick to be able to answer, isn't that what causes World War I, or has something to do with what starts World War I? And the answer is yes, right? So officially annexed in 1908, and we see in June of 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir apparent to the Habsburg throne, is visiting Sarajevo, with his wife, and they will eventually both be assassinated, both be killed. Right, by, I generally ask by whom, and most students are pretty aware that it was a Serbian. Some say, some even know that he's that Peasant is from the Black Hand. It's a Serbian group, and sometimes students will say a Serbian terrorist group. Sometimes they'll say a Serbian nationalist group. And of course, irregardless of what a student says in that situation, it's a good little time to point out, perception and point of view. So, Peasant and the Black Hand were definitely a nationalist group if you are, a pan-Slav, pro-Serbian independence person. And they're definitely a terrorist organization if you are a supporter of the Habsburgs in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. All right, so in 1878, we see Bosnia-Herzegovina. We see, Romania, right? And we see, declared as an autonomous state, Bulgaria, right? So Bulgaria, so they're going to be recognized as autonomous in 1898, and then actual independence is in 1908, the same year that the Habsburgs, the Habsburgs will annex Bosnia. All right, so just kind of show you kind of where I ended up with that. All right, so there you go. So massive loss of land, right, is taking place even before World War I happens, and then of course after World War I happens, right, to kind of just switch back now. After World War I happens, right, kind of get to 1920, and you see all of these lands, right? So the western part of the Arabian Peninsula, the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, right, the land around the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys, they're going to be lost after World War I. All right, so and then there's going to be an immediate war against the Greeks in the aftermath of World War I. And then eventually Ataturk, come into power and then establishing what are the kind of normal borders here. All right, so because of loss of land, we probably need to distinguish this. Right, so let's just kind of put a post World War I, right? Post World War I, Mesopotamia. All right, so that's the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys. Right, that is lost. Western Arabian Peninsula. So the city of Mecca. All right, so and of course this is a massively significant thing psychologically. It's not just that they're losing land, but they've also lost the most important city, lost control of the most important city within Islam. And if I throw in, also they lose Palestine, right? They lose all three of the most important cities, Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, all lost. So when we talk about Ataturk, when he comes to power, he never really makes an attempt to regain this land. These are simply allowed to go. Right. All right. Then you got a ton of internal factors as well. Right. So, and maybe one of the one of the ways to kind of look at this is is maybe just by saying a refugee crisis takes place. Right. So there is in the late 1800s, right? When we start talking about the loss of, Southeast Europe by the Ottomans, the question then becomes, what happens to this Muslim population that has been living there for the past, 700-800 years? What happens to them? And, in the late 1800s, so late 1800s through, let's just say, World War I, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6 million Muslims are displaced, killed, right, and forced to relocate to Anatolian Peninsula, right, where modern day Turkey is. And then well, kind of continuing to talk about this, post World War One, right? Post World War One, somewhere in the neighborhood of 380,000 through about 500,000 Muslims forced out of Greece, right, to Turkey, to the Anatolian Plateau. So, somewhere in the neighborhood of 400,000-ish people are going to be, forced out of Greece. Muslims are going to be forced out of Greece. There is reciprocation going on, though, in this situation. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.5 million Greeks are forced out of Turkey. All right, so we see this kind of migration both ways. And there are a few moments in history where we see this take place as borders get changed and settled. Probably the most famous example is going to be in 1947 with Pakistan and India. We see that kind of massive swap around in borders. All right, so that's that's kind of the big migration thing and refugee crisis that happens. All right, let me scoot out of this real quick. Let's just kind of skim through a couple of these slides, just kind of give you kind of what some of this is. All right, so insert Ataturk, right? Kind of insert Ataturk into the situation. Right, so when we talk about Ataturk, I simply want to make sure you understand the reforms, right? Radically secularizing, westernizing reforms that happened between 1923 and 1938 when he passes, because they are extremely radical. And there's a couple things that we need to kind of understand about this and how it happens and why it happens. For one thing, if you understand what we just talked about, that the Ottoman Empire was a fraction of what it once was, kind of wrap your mind around the idea of, say, the United States losing all of its land west of the Mississippi River, and we're reduced to, what the United States used to be in the late 1700s, right? There's a psychological impact of that. Think about losing control of the three most important cities within Islam, Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, right? Loss of that, on top of the land, it's also massively symbolic and religious. On top of that, think about the refugee crisis, the displacement of millions of people, right? That takes place, and there's really nothing that can be done about it. You factor in those kinds of conditions, those kinds of things, people are going to be willing to accept changes that would be unthinkable under other kind of situations, right? But of course, we also need to think about who's going to usher in those changes. And of course, insert Ataturk, right? So Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And he is a war hero. And a war hero from Gallipoli. Now, I know most of my students have never heard of Gallipoli before. However, if you are, if you're from Turkey, or if you are from Australia or New Zealand, you've definitely heard of Gallipoli before, right? So Gallipoli, from the Australian or New Zealand, the Anzac point of view, is something that every school child learns about in Australia, New Zealand, right? Because of the sacrifices made there by the Anzacs. There is a film that was made about it called Gallipoli, starring a very young Mel Gibson, if you're interested in kind of period piece films. Right, but Gallipoli is, and what I do usually say in classes, think about D-Day, which every American kid knows about. Think about D-Day and the kind of, we throw 150,000 troops at the beaches of Normandy, right, both airborne and amphibious. Imagine if all those forces had been repelled, right? Most of them died, and we never take a single beach, right? We don't keep the beach. This is what Gallipoli is for the Anzacs. The Anzac soldiers, the Australian New Zealand soldiers, were ordered onto the beaches of Gallipoli by the British, right? Commanded by the British, and they were forcefully repelled. And of course, the hero from Gallipoli, this is Mustafa Kemal. This is Ataturk. He is a hero that emerges out of this period at a time when there's not much to celebrate for the Ottomans, right? So we have a dynamic nationalist personality, and he will usher in the reforms that he believes are necessary, in order to give the Turkish people back control of their own fate, because in the years leading up to World War I and during World War I, and what was happening afterwards, it looked like they had lost control, right, of their own destiny. So reforms, right? So this will, and you can kind of see here, he won't try to kind of get back what was lost, and then he initially begins in 1924 by making a very major reform, eliminating the caliphate. All right, so I'm just gonna kind of put here 2, right, reforms, right, reforms by Ataturk, right, and sometimes I think Strayer refers to this as Kemalism. All right, I think that's you'll see it all kinds of different ways. So I'm going to flip this over, right, kind of repeat that. Number 2, these are the reforms, right? And really what we're talking about here is westernization, secular, right, non-religious, right, and modernization. Right, and there are a lot of them. All right, so let's kind of start off by saying like 1924, right, ends the caliphate. All right, so the caliphate had been in existence. I mean, really, once we start talking about after Muhammad dies in 632, we have the 4 rightly guided caliphs, we have the Umayyad Caliphate, we have the Abbasid Caliphate. When the Mongols destroy the Abbasid Caliphate, we have the Mamluks, and then they will establish a caliph, and then they will control Mecca, from Egypt. And then with the rise of the Ottomans around 1518 or so, when the Mamluks are conquered by the Ottomans, the Ottomans will have the caliphate right up until 1924. Right, so there's right, this is big. This is a major reform, right, that gets made. And then there's a whole host of others, and I'm gonna just kind of swap back and forth here with you. Again, let me do this. All right, so so we have a secular state, right, and I usually kind of read this in class to kind of mentally prepare what we're about to talk about. A civilized international dress is worthy and appropriate for our nation. We will wear boots and shoes on our feet, trousers on our legs, shirt and tie, jacket, waistcoat. And of course, to complete these, a covering with a brim on our heads. I want to make this clear. This head covering is called a hat. All right, so what is he talking about, and why is he clarifying that point? Right, there are major reforms that are going to get made, right? So in major kind of cultural traditions that are going to be banned, right? So let's kind of just look through some of these real quick. So changes the Turkish alphabet from Arabic letters to Roman ones, right? So that would be a good number 2 for you, right? So the Turkish alphabet had always been phonetically Turkish in Arabic, but now they're switching over to Roman letters. So it would read like or look very similar to German or French or Italian or English or French, right? Right, mandates the call to prayer to be in Turkish rather than in Arabic, right? So he's not making Turkish language required inside the mosque, but outside the mosque, it becomes a requirement. All right. Closes all religious courts in schools. All right. Closes all the religious courts in schools. That'd be a good number 4 for you on your list. All right. Abolishes the Ministry of Canon Law and Pious Foundations. The example in class I usually say is, like, if you're familiar with how the U.S. government is structured, where we have different cabinet departments in our government, Department of Transportation, Department of Homeland Security, right? So this is an entire, government sector that was abolished, right? So you don't need a Ministry of Canon Law, religious law, if the courts are now being run by the state. Lifts the ban on alcohol, right? Lifts the ban on alcohol. Right, adopts a Gregorian calendar in place of the Islamic calendar. So I always kind of make sure students know what the word Gregorian means, Gregorian calendar, right? So this is the calendar that we use in the United States, a kind of a Christian-based calendar. So this is the kind of the second major Christian calendar that was created after the Julian calendar, right? Makes Sunday the day of rest, right? Kind of the traditional Christian day instead of Friday. Forbids the wearing of the fez, right? So what are we talking about here, right? Elimination of traditional cultural practices. Requires all Turks to choose a surname, right? Westernization. And it's not that there wasn't opposition, right? It's simply opposition was banned, right? So, and not just opposition was banned. Leftist, you can insert the word socialist there. Leftist workers' organizations were also banned, right? And of course, Turkish nationalism was, right, had to be prioritized over other nationalist claims that existed within, that take place within, the Middle East. And of course, one of these nationalist things that pops up is Kurdish nationalism during this time. And of course, the Kurds, if you're not familiar with the Kurds, I think we talked about them in class maybe once. We talked about Saladin, of Kurdish origin, right? So the Kurds are an ethnic group or an ethnic minority group that exists within the Ottoman Empire, a little northern Syria, northern Iraq, right? So, and they were not given a state, right? So for various reasons, right, which we can talk about Sykes-Picot later, for various reasons, the Kurds, live within the borders of other countries, and it's still an issue today, right? This is not an issue that has died, but Ataturk will kind of prevent any issues associated with that. All right, and then we're also going to get, so I guess by this point you're probably up to number 12, women's rights, right? We're going to see women's rights. So we see that this is pre-Ataturk, the 1917 marriage laws. But during the Ataturk, we see by 1930, women are allowed to vote in local elections. In 1934, women are allowed to vote in the National Assembly elections, right? So we see women's suffrage. All right. All right. So by the time we get there, Turkish women appear in the streets without a veil. Was an object. Okay. So right. So what do we see as soon as women are given the right to vote? We see by 1935, we see over a dozen women. These 18 women are elected to Parliament. All right. So this is why are we seeing these kinds of kind of gender equality movements taking place in Turkey, but we don't see, like, Saudi Arabia, women given the right to vote until well after the year 2000. Right. This is Ataturk, westernization, secularization. Right. So one of the realities of emulating Western society, right, one of the realities is gender equality. Right. So we do see a movement towards that. So then the question becomes, how much buy-in is there, right? How much do these legal reforms really matter? I mean, obviously there is buy-in if we have, well over a dozen women get elected in their very first opportunity. But, how widespread is this? I always find this kind of an interesting passage coming out in 1929. Right. So please feel free to pause and read this. All right, so welcome back. So when we talk about this in class, I simply ask, like, how do you make sense of this passage with everything we just talked about, right? Is this compatible with what we just learned about, and why or why not, right? And the obvious answer here is no, right? And most students are able to kind of explain this by saying there's a reality of political reforms that are made. And then there's a reality of cultural norms that are continued. All right, and if you were able to pick up on that, then that's really good. To help clarify this, I usually use the example in the United States. I mean, we are in the year 2021 now. Everywhere in the United States, we have same-sex marriage. And if I were to ask the question, is same-sex marriage accepted by everyone in the United States? Most students are able to identify that there are some people who culturally have not accepted, that practice simply because it is, even though it's legally allowed, right? And this is what we're seeing take place here in Turkey. We have certain, legal reforms that have been made, political changes that have been made, but we're seeing a continuity of some cultural beliefs, right? And this is another interesting passage, that kind of looks at the situation that women were in, a paradox, right? Women are encouraged to go into the workplace. Women are also encouraged to not excel beyond their male peers in that same workplace. Women have cultural expectations within the house that don't change just because women are able to go work outside, and they're even encouraged to work outside the house. Those, these are, this is a paradox in which, still survives in the United States to this day. So not shocking to see that it exists in Turkey, kind of at the moment in which women were first given rights. All right, so that's probably a good stopping point for today. So a few key takeaways, right? And we'll kind of go over these again tomorrow. So as the world enters the 20th century, several major land empires, and then we're going to see within the first couple of decades, many of these empires collapse, right? And, so today we've been talking about the Ottomans, right? And tomorrow we'll look at Russia. You're going to see, as well as with this, a number of different peasant-based revolts. And I would encourage you to look at the website under the political crisis, kind of just look up from what you're watching right now. I would encourage you to read down through what happens in Mexico, right? And because that is another kind of high probability topic on the AP exam. All right, so that is all for today. Sapriati.